So, these are things. I was listening to a preacher this morning also, just kind of, I think it was David Jeremiah. It sounded like his voice. It may have been someone else, so I don't want to directly quote him. But he said that some theologians, I don't know how theological they are, some theologians say that Matthew 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount, is actually not for us today. It's not for the Christian. That's a hyper-dispensational argument. That he was teaching the ethic to Jews. Has nothing to do with the church age or Christianity, which, if there was ever a misinterpretation in the entire universe, that is it. It is the Christian manifesto, the Sermon on the Mount. But he said, I think that some people arrive at that opinion not for theological reasons, but out of fear. You ever looked at that thing? It's dangerous. That is, of course, unless you explain it away, and we are pretty good at explaining things away, aren't we? It's dangerous. Isn't it amazing that in all this reform that's going on, all these people rediscovering historical theology and historical Christianity and the Reformation and everything else, that we sure talk a lot about the book of Romans, the book of Ephesians, but we don't talk a whole lot about the Sermon on the Mount. Because with the book of Romans and the book of Ephesians, at least up until chapter 12 in Romans and up till chapter 4 in Ephesians, you can just use those truths to pontificate, to debate, to show everyone how clever you are exegetically. But the Sermon on the Mount, it's not about how smart you are. It's about taking up your cross and following a master whose way of life is a complete and total contradiction of everything the world will tell you to do. Maybe you've heard this story before. I had a guy who was kind of discipling me when I first became a believer at the University of Texas, and just so happened we were both at different hours, but we both had the same psych professor. And immediately, even though I was a new Christian, I recognized this guy is, if he's not the Antichrist, he's his cousin. He would stand up on the platform, huge auditorium, and mock God. He would dare the students to record him and then play him backwards to get satanic messages. He made fun of everything sacred. He was a beast when it came to spirituality. He railed against authorities and powers. He was a horrid man. And you could tell he was miserable. One day, my friend Mike, he had the class right before me, and he came out of the class. I'm kind of walking towards the building. He's got the biggest smile on his face. He said, "Oh, I love that class." I go, "What? What class?" "The psych class. I love that class. I am learning how to live based on everything I'm hearing in that class." And I'm like, new believer, and I'm going, "But Mike, you told me that guy, He goes, "Yes. Listen to everything he says, do just the opposite, and you'll have the scriptures." And that's true. Now, the problem is when the church and her ministers have a prophetic voice, but only theologically. When the prophetic voice is only prophetic theologically and not ethically, there's your problem. There is a theological lackadaisicalness, theological apathy But the greater apathy is with regard to living out this stuff. When I look at believers, sincere believers in Jesus Christ, sometimes I'll see a guy walking into walls and everything else and walk up to him and say, what's going on? Man, Romans 7. I just can't figure out, is it a believer or an unbeliever? Sometimes you see someone wrestling like that, or when I'm working on something all day and at the end I realize I went in the wrong direction. It's frustrating. But that's not what I normally see among believers. I don't see them struggling with great truths that's painted such concern on their face. I see them struggling with the inability to live out the ethical teachings of Jesus Christ and the apostles. I don't see anyone that comes up to me and goes, look, I'm really not understanding Ephesians 5 and its commands with regard to my responsibility to my wife. But I see them saying, I can't live this. I'm not living this. So you don't just want to have a theological voice. You want to have an ethical voice. Now, another thing that is extremely important. I know we're rambling, but all these things are things that I just want to touch on. I'm not going to be here now for a couple of weeks. I have to go preach. There is a theological vagueness. Do you realize that? Mission organizations are experts at this. Why? Their creed or their confession of faith, they reduce it down and make it so general so that they might take in as many supporters as possible. When you start defining things theologically in your mission statement and saying this is what we believe as opposed to this, then you're going to have a lot of people say, I'm not supporting your mission organization because you believe this and I don't. But if you're all about just the very basics, then you can draw from a wider range of people. So there's a theological vagueness out there, and it's very dangerous. But those of us who pride ourselves on the specificity of our theology, those of us who take to heart that we do not want to be vague but specific in the great doctrines of Christianity, do we, with our ethic, turn right around and commit the same error? Not of a theological vagueness, but an ethical vagueness. Well, that's just a matter of conscience. Well, that's just the way you see it. Isn't it amazing? You get in a theological debate and people will say to you, well, that's just the way you see it. They won't talk grammar. They won't talk context. They won't search church history. They just go, that's your opinion. That's the way you see the text. That's not the way I see the text. That's a theological vagueness. Very dangerous. Relativism, actually, is what it is. Those of us who hate that, do we do the same thing when it comes to ethics? An ethical vagueness. And if someone gets real specific in theology, those who prefer to have a vague theology say, you're just splitting hairs. But in a world of ethical vagueness and a Christianity that is very vague in its ethic, when someone starts getting specific, everyone looks at him and says, you're a legalist. Now there are men who split hairs. A dead scholasticism, theologically, with regard to how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And there are legalists. But just because there are scholastics who try to search out things in Scripture that are not there, and just because there are legalists does not mean that we have the right to be vague in